Hi, everybody. My name is Nancy Belmont, and I'm the Director of Faith Formation for MCCW Worldwide. Welcome to our Joyful Momentum Week 4 book club. We're talking this week about chapters 6 and 7, Return to Draw Water and Practicing Assessment, and chapter 7, Go to Your Sister, Resolving Conflict with Mercy. I am joined today by Kim Miller, our MCCW Worldwide President. We're like switching it up a little bit this week, and our author, Elizabeth Tomlin, who's also the Director of Finance for MCCW Worldwide. So we're going to jump right in. Practicing assessment. A big thing that really stuck out to me this week was when she talks on page 101 about, well, first of all, St. Catherine Drexel, whom I love, but she said, Elizabeth said, as you implement the assessment process, consider making a novena with your leadership team. And it just made me think of the most important thing we have to do when we're about to make an assessment. Pray, then act. Don't act, then pray. There's a speaker I love, Father Simon. He's on Relevant Radio, and he's like, he always says, remember what the apostles did. They prayed for 9 days and then they went out. So many times we want to have all these meetings. We want to have all these actions, and then we're going to get together and pray. No, we have to do more praying, and then we act. So Kim and Elizabeth, what do you think about that, and how does that factor into assessment and determining if what we're doing is effective?
Well, I think that's a really good point, Nancy. And I think we were chatting a little before this about the fact that our work in ministry is to bring people closer to Christ. And so if we don't go to Christ first and say, hey, like, guide us, lead us, help us know what it is you want us to do, help us to be open to whatever these assessments tell us is going to help us do our ministry of bringing people closer to you, then we've kind of missed the mark before we even start.
Yep. Concur.
And we were also talking, Nancy, about in that prayer, part of that prayer being a prayer for humility, because sometimes assessment of something that we are doing or we are leading can feel like criticism, and that can be hard to be open to. Sorry, y'all, I'm in the middle of moving and I just got interrupted by a small person. But I think sometimes assessment can feel like assessment of us instead of assessment of our ministry. Just 1 second, okay? And so making part of that prayer a prayer for humility, a prayer for the grace to be open to whatever that assessment says, I think that's an important step to take before you start to.
Yeah, and I think in chapel groups, you have assessment that comes at different times. So in your women's ministry at your local installation or your civilian parish, your assessment might come when there's been a transition of leaders. So it may be that a new leadership team is assessing the work of a previous leadership team. And you've got to be really careful about respecting the work of the people that it's come before you, because their work is done for the purpose of mission. Like no one wants to do ministry work other than to lead people to Christ. No one wants to do ministry work, to do a bad job. No one wants to do ministry work to do a bad job. So we have to be careful when we're assessing the work of a previous leadership team to give it due credit, that it was done in the spirit of serving other people, that it was done generously, that it was done prayerfully. So that's one type of assessment. And then the other type of assessment is assessing our own work. And you're right, it can feel like personal criticism if you've given a written assessment to your membership to read that they really like this program, but they didn't like that program, or they really liked your talk on Mary, but they didn't like your talk on Joseph. It feels like personal criticism. And when we were talking earlier, we talked about the litany of humility, which I think is just such a powerful prayer when doing any sort of assessment for transition. So it's like, I'll just read some of the highlights, but it's a litany. So it's like, introductory phrase in response. So, Lord Jesus, meek and humble of heart, hear me. From the desire of being esteemed, deliver me, Jesus. From the desire of being loved, deliver me, Jesus. From the desire of being extolled, deliver me. So really, really helping you pare down your own ego and predispositions to get to the heart of the matter of, like, Lord Jesus, what do you want me to do? Which is really the question all of our assessments, the goal of our assessments should be, like, Lord Jesus, what do you want us to do? How can we do it better? I should post the litany.
Absolutely. So I think there's room in there then, for prayer at the beginning. And then also once you get that assessment, so if you're in a chapel ministry and you're at the end of the year to find out what did everyone in this chapel group think of all the things that we did this year, and I'm going to pass that off to the next team. I think there's a lot of room for prayer, like as you're assessing it, like, okay, so we're hearing this from the women. God, is this the direction you're asking us to go in? And kind of praying your way through assessing the assessment. So not just taking the survey, because giving everyone a survey at the last gathering of the year is important, or sending it out via email is important. But then what do you do with that information once it's not enough just to do the survey and like, all right, Uh-oh, are we frozen? No.
You're kind of frozen, Kim. I'm wondering if you sign off and sign back on. I don't think it'll mess with the recording, but it might like refresh your connection. Well, that looks better now.
Okay. Are you guys back?
I think you're okay now.
I'm sorry. I think the internet is not doing well at my house.
No. I think in this chapter, St. Catherine Drexel, Nancy, I know you love St. Catherine Drexel. She's the only saint that I incorporated into 2 chapters back to back. And the first one was was about going to the well. So where is Jesus calling you to serve? And she is the one who famously said to the Pope, like, why don't Holy Father, you send missionaries to the Black and Indian populations in the United States? And he looked at her and said, well, why not, my daughter, you yourself become a missionary? And she did, like, she went out. But as climate changed in the United States, like schools were integrated, you're so cute. But as schools were integrated, she had a lot of schools for Native American and African American populations, and they were segregated by race because that was the law of the land. She, like, external factors caused her order to say, okay, we're going to close this school and integrate our schools. And so in doing so, they had to make some tough choices for their ministry, like which schools were they going to close, which property were they going to sell, in order to fulfill their mission work in the climate in which the new climate in which they were living. And so, in that assessment led to the integration of schools of Catholic schools in Nashville, and then also, later on in her ministry. Well, even after her death, the religious order has looked at some of their schools that were for Native American populations, and they've said, our schools are so integrated, we don't need to have schools specifically for these populations anymore. So they closed them and then funded instead scholarships for underserved populations to attend, newly integrated schools. And that was probably a hard decision, to close schools that were opened with so much love to serve a population, but then to realize that the right way to continue to serve the people that you're called to serve is to fund sending them to schools where they'll get a different education, or to even in some instances, the mission of the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament is to serve the underserved. And so they've had to make decisions in their religious order to include closing the shrine of St. Catherine Drexel and moving her, because the cost of maintaining the shrine was not helping them to further the mission of the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament. So like, I can't imagine a mission that was more important to the people who raised all the funds to make the Shrine of St. Catherine Drexel, to build the Shrine of St. Catherine Drexel. Like, that was a really important mission to them. And then, 20 years later, the same religious order made the decision to close the shrine and move it. So if we want an intercessor on, assessment and making hard decisions, she's one. Like, she fearlessly went to the population she was called to serve, and then didn't shy away from assessment and making changes to further the mission, but it was always about the mission.
One of the things we spoke about on our latest chat for chapters 4 and 5, we talked about, Patty was talking about how in her, we were talking about how to minister to people who might not be on social media. And so Patty was talking about a communications coordinator that they have at Fort Lee, and how that person, because they have a large retiree or older population, that she writes letters and writes notes to people. And it really blew my mind, because we kind of have a communications coordinator position at West Point. But I was like, wow, during this time, how can that position evolve to do something like that? And we may not have, most of our people are on social media, but to receive a card, that's kind of a special thing. It's a kind of a really nice outreach. In the chapter, Elizabeth, in chapter 6, on page 100, Elizabeth talks about having free downloadable versions of surveys and different ministry roles. She said she's gonna put them on Joyful Momentum this week. And I'm looking at this, and my mouth dropped wide open actually when I saw this, because Elizabeth has made a PDF, Roles in Ministry, that has job descriptions for the faith study coordinator or treasurer. So if during this time, during the summer, you're thinking about where to go next with your CWSE group, and maybe you're thinking about what you have in place, how that could be maybe how you can adjust the roles, or maybe if you look at this could kind of open your eyes to a ministry, an apostolate you don't have. And it's a great starting point for roles in ministry. So I want everybody to check that out. Elizabeth, how did you develop that, and how do you think that would look a little bit different in terms of COVID? How can that help us reform our ministries?
So I thought through, so for the position descriptions, I thought through, what's like your bread and butter leader, what do you need on your bread and butter leadership team, and kind of based it off of what MCCW and CWOC typically does. So some chapels use the term like president, vice president. Some chapels use the term like women's ministry coordinator, faith study coordinator. And really the title doesn't matter so much as giving people roles and responsibilities, and making it clear what you're expecting of them. So people who come I'm going to use the term volunteer, but within their vocation, come to serve within a chapel, they all want to do a good job. And if you can communicate in writing that your faith study coordinator is expected to help select a faith study, help find facilitators to teach the faith study, provide some tools to equip faith study teachers to teach a faith study, you're setting that person up for being able to serve the ministry within how the leadership team has discerned they want the ministry to work. So that's why I came up with written descriptions, because I think that if you tell somebody like, hey, I want you to do outreach, but you give them no guidance, well, then your outreach coordinator is going to do whatever your outreach coordinator personally feels called to do. But if you open up the conversation and say, we want an outreach coordinator, here's how our team has prayerfully considered we want what we believe outreach should look like for this chapel. Are you able to do this? Would you like to do this? You're setting everybody up for success. So I wrote kind of an expansive list of positions that your leadership team might include, hospitality coordinator, communications, a treasurer. You might not need a treasurer. If you have no budget, then you don't need a treasurer. A coordinator, volunteer coordinator, parish liaison. So it's meal train coordinator. If you have a big community and lots of people having babies, you might want someone to coordinate, who's sending meals to who. So it's kind of an expansive list. But if, a women's ministry starts just one by one, two by two. So you might not need a big leadership team, but as you grow, it's a point of assessment where you might want to put one in place. So it's, but largely based off of like much of the book, it's largely based off of answering the question, how do I grow a CWOC? How do I grow a women's ministry? So it's scalable to what your community needs.
I think the job descriptions are a great starting point for assessment. So at the end of the year, when you want to ask people, how are we doing in this area? How are we doing on this? What did you think of how we did this? Going back to those job descriptions and saying, did our hospitality part of our ministry do X, Y, and Z? It can help you kind of formulate those questions in a way that is specifically tailored to the ministry that you have in your chapel. Because, different chapel communities look really different. Like you said, if you're a brand new group starting out, you're not going to have maybe all of the different positions. You might have one or two things.
Well, in a way, this, I think Kim froze.
A tool for creating.
Yeah.
Oh, geez.
Sorry, Kim. A way this played out in MCCW, though, is we realized, so the MCCW leadership team 3 years ago was set up so that you had to be an active duty service member or spouse of active duty to serve on the board. And we realized that our MCCW membership is bigger than active duty. Our retirees are incredibly important to our chapel communities. And we wanted a way to incorporate their wisdom and leadership onto the MCCW team. So we created a couple of positions on the MCCW's board that were open to retirees. So we have 3 director-at-large positions that retirees or spouses of retirees can serve in. And the purpose of that was, one, to make sure our retirees know that we love and include and value and want them in MCCW and are here, and MCCW is here to serve them. And 2, to acknowledge that our retirees have a lot of wisdom and gifts and talents to continue to offer to the church. And you don't cease to be a member of MCCW, or you don't cease to be welcome at a chapel group because either you or your spouse have wrapped up your time on active duty service to the country. Our church is bigger than that. And so that was a point that we came to because of assessment. And because of that, we have Eleanor Gentilini on our board, who has been involved in MCCW since the 60s or 70s. I mean, Eleanor has been involved a long time. So if you need a historical data point, she's your girl. Then we have Bernadette Kovalsik on our board, who has just a love for catechesis, a love for youth ministry in the Archdiocese. And so she's always good about helping us tie into what MCCW is doing that fits within the Archdiocese. And then Denise Hummel, our other director at large, has a great passion for seminarians, for working with our AMS co-sponsored seminarians. And so with her service, she's been able to connect our local chapel groups to sponsoring, spiritually adopting seminarians. So any chapel group within the Archdiocese can reach out to Denise, and she's able to link them to a seminarian to pray for, sponsor, send care packages to. And if MCCW hadn't taken the time to say, okay, our retirees are valuable, we need to serve our retirees, and we need to let our retirees serve MCCW, we would be missing out. But it only came through assessment.
Mm-hmm. Well, we'll start wrapping up this chapter, because I like to be even-handed with both chapters. But other things that I took away from this were kind of respecting the fact when you evaluate something and when you realize that something needs to change, because you have taken, you've taken the time to look at your program, think about how it's serving or not serving optimally your constituents. Just really do that carefully and respectfully, realizing, like you said, that people hopefully have put their heart and soul in it for the glory of God. So respecting that, kind of deferring to other people, and that constant assessment, if we're constantly assessing, you'll be able to make incremental changes instead of like doing a huge overhaul, which can be kind of traumatic for a community, and can lead to more resistance. So it can be tempting to move immediately to the next project without assessing our work or leaving notes or continuity files, especially if you've done something really like a retreat or something, which is like, it's been like a marathon. You could be like, whoa, that's over. Like, it's really important to leave some kind of continuity files. And nowadays, I mean, what I like how we handle it with MCCW is we're into the Google Docs and we like share it with everybody, and it becomes kind of a living document. So that is really helpful, I find, just pop it on with something like that. And then it's also not so final. You can go back and say, oh, I thought of something else, and say, hey, everybody, I made a change to it, but it's a living document. And other people can kind of use their input. It could be collaborative.
Nancy, I think that's a really good point too about not giant changes all at once, especially in our chapel groups where our leadership does turn over so much for so many chapel groups every year. I think there's a tendency to come in and I'm excited and I have fresh and new ideas and I want to do all my fresh and new things, but you don't necessarily want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Like, stop and look at what's working well for your chapel, what's working well in that community, what people in that community feel is meeting their needs, and then add some of your fresh and new ideas. But do that in a way that is respectful of what the leaders before you were doing, what was working for that community, so that there's a balance between tradition and steadfast sort of leadership and programming, but also, refreshing it every year with new ideas.
And I have a policy of like, if someone's a volunteer, someone wants to help, I try not to do anything to discourage them unless they are like super toxic, which we'll get into in the next the next chapter. Like, if you have gifts and talents, like, I want to find a way to help you express those, to enrich our community, and maybe I can help you tweak those. But like, I would never want to do anything that somebody would see as like threatening or destroying their baby. Like, maybe I could tweak it, but like really having a deep respect for people and their passions. And you talk about St. Catherine, sometimes the adjustments are not easy, but if you keep God's call on your community at the forefront, that helps a lot. And if you keep your eyes on being a community of prayer and seated in God's will and not necessarily my will, like you said, with that humility, Elizabeth.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, let's move on to resolving conflict with mercy. Elizabeth said the buzzwords on page 107 that I always hate to hear. We've already done that. We tried that, but it didn't work. What do you do when you're trying to innovate, when you're trying to evaluate, when you are trying to be deferential to people, but you hear those roadblocks?
That's so hard. I mean, when I've been around, the Archdiocese, I've been around CWOCs and MCCW for a long time. And so often I would be willing to say over 90% of the time, when someone calls me and says, I'm really struggling with my chapel, or if a parish coordinator calls me and says, I'm really struggling with my CWOC leadership, 9 times out of 10, the conflict comes down to certain people wanting to change things and certain people saying, we've tried that before, it doesn't work. Or, people want to come in and do this. It didn't work before, so we're not going to do it again, but they haven't been here to understand that it didn't work before. So, so that conflict, it's like it's an evergreen conflict. And I think we have to, again, go back to prayer, like pray for humility to serve and to let others serve. Pray for a spirit of renewal, just a constant spirit of renewal. Like we say we are Easter people. What does that mean? That means every day we need to wake up and say, Jesus Christ is risen. This is an opportunity. Like this is an exciting day for us to serve, for us to be open, for us to share the gospel. And we have to remain open to doing it in different ways. So it's a hard one. So I think if this is a conflict that you're having in your chapel, to pray for a spirit of renewal, pray for missionary disciples, people who feel called to go out and to serve, and seek to understand. Like you've got to build relationships with people. And if you are, chapel staff, you as chapel staff have a responsibility to build relationships with people coming in every year, and a responsibility to equip them and empower them to serve. That's a responsibility of being on a chapel staff. But as parishioners or as chapel congregants, you have a responsibility to get to know your chapel staff too. So like we can't approach ministry as consumers. Like we go to the chapel and expect the chapel to give us a program. And I think that chapel parish coordinators, religious education coordinators can't look at in CWC leadership can't look at their roles as like, our job is to provide you with programs. That's not it. Like CWC ministry is not just program providers. We are equipping people to serve the church. And so the programming or the action has to go like participant, leadership, and you've got to work this way. It's not leadership here, because that misses the point. But I think there's a lot of conflict that happens between, does leadership do this, or do congregants do this to the leadership? And it's got to mesh. It's easier said than done, though. I will give you that.
One thing I often find is like, I like how you talk about its relationships. And when I think of conflict, Elizabeth had a really good insight on this. I always think when people are like, I'm in conflict with somebody in my chapel, I always go, did you Matthew 18 it? That's what I think about. Like, it's about kind of the chain of command of conflict management. So like, so many times I'll hear, like, oh, my priest said something, so I took it to the archdiocese. Whoa, hold on. Or I had a problem with a fellow sister in my CWC, so I talked to the priest about it. In Matthew 18, Jesus says, if your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he listens to you, you have won over your brother. If he does not listen, take one or two others along with you, so that every fact may be established on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. If he refuses to listen to them, tell the church. If he refuses to listen even to the church, then treat him as you would a Gentile or a tax collector. And so I always try to, it's always better to deal with conflict at the lowest level first. And we kind of owe it to each other to do that. And, so many times, think about that. If you've ever had a conflict with a person, have you done it that way? Have you gone one-on-one, then brought another person in, then gone to an authority, and then dismissed them? Or have you talked to them or brought it to the priest, and then immediately you're like, I'm done with this person. I don't want to deal with them. But Elizabeth brought up a really good little detail about that. She brought up the fact that has to deal with sin. And you were talking about that not all conflict is sinful, which if you could talk a little bit more about that. Okay, you're not frozen. Good.
So yeah, so the preamble of Matthew chapter 18 is if your brother has sinned against you. So there's an idea that there was sin in the conflict. And if there is a sinful conflict, that is the paradigm. Go to him. If he doesn't listen, bring someone else who has authority, like rightful authority in the church. Like, don't go bring in the person who's going to side with you because you're just trying to bully the person into submission. But I think it's a good paradigm for how to resolve conflict, even if there is not sin in your chapel group, is to go to that person individually first before trying to pull anyone else in, because women are very intuitive. We also take things personally, and we also make a lot of assumptions. Like if I tell somebody something and their response is, I can take that a lot of ways. It might be I'm annoyed with you. It might be somebody was just trying not to yawn. And so we've got to start at the lowest level of just trying to understand people. But also with conflict and trying to resolve it, that Matthew 18 paradigm also presupposes that the other person is willing to talk with you and willing to engage with you and willing to resolve a conflict. So if you have a situation where you're feeling like there's a conflict and you're trying to resolve it, but no one will speak with you, it really limits your ability. It limits your ability to resolve a conflict. So I talked in the chapter about kind of stonewalling, this idea that you approach someone to resolve a conflict and the response is like, what conflict? I don't know what you're talking about. That's, if you've got that going on, then you've got more toxicity than just simple conflict resolution. And that's kind of like beyond this. Like, I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a social worker. So if you've got like significant toxicity going on, that's kind of beyond the scope of the chapter. So I'm really trying to deal with like the more simple day-to-day conflicts, and that Matthew 18 paradigm is really good for that. But it also presupposes that people want to be in relationship and want to reconcile and want to live peaceably. And if you're in a chapel group and that's not in your heart to reconcile and to cooperate and to work peaceably and to resolve conflict, then I would encourage you really to seek out some counsel for that, because we have a responsibility to live peaceably and to cooperate. And you have to bring that spirit into your chapel group. And if you personally are not, you need to step away until you're in a position where you can, because there's no point in being the source of conflict. There's no point in doing that.
I think we have a great tool at our disposal, right, as Catholics for just that, Elizabeth. I think seeking out opportunities for reconciliation when you are in a situation where the conflict is greater than you can resolve on your own, or if the conflict is in your heart and you're having a hard time finding the peace to move forward and to help be part of that reconciliation, part of that healing that needs to happen in that conflict. I think getting yourself to confession is probably a good place to start. That's where I have to start a lot of the time. And that's a good tool that we have as Catholics to take advantage of when we are in a situation of conflict. I think we could all take advantage of that.
This has made me think about, hopefully we haven't had too much conflict the last few months because we've been apart, but that provides its own problems, because if we had conflict before that we didn't resolve, and then we're apart for 4 months, that conflict doesn't go away. It just gets tabled. So maybe we might have to be prepared for some rough spots as we reunite together, as we try to plan for the fall, and just as we evaluate where we've been, we may have to, evaluate our relationships. And like you said, I love that part in this chapter where you talk about, like, ask for forgiveness. You can ask for forgiveness and give it as well. So, endeavor to move forward together in this spirit of service. But, just recognize that, oh, great, we're starting over. There might be some past hurt there that needs to be addressed before you can move forward.
Yeah.
I think, Nancy, a good point too, that as our child seeks to start back up for the fall, there may be conflict that we've tabled because we've been apart for 4 or 5 months, but there may also be conflict that we find coming up about how we're restarting. I know people just in my innermost circle of friends and family who feel very different about what the right approach to starting things back up, not just ministry, but, how do we begin gathering again? What is safe? What is not safe? And so I think, especially in these times, if we can be prayerful about knowing how we feel and about how we are prayerful about how we're going to be open to how other people feel about that, and recognizing that there are a lot of different opinions about what the right way to get back to normal, whatever normal is going to look like, is, I think, anticipate that there may be rough spots, there may be bumps in the road as we all try to figure out the right way to restart our chapel groups, to restart those gatherings. And that there also might be, different opinions about how we handle things during the conflict, during the pandemic. I know some people, have felt like we needed to do more, or you needed to do less, or so just being mindful that those kind of conflicts may arise too as we're starting out again.
And always defer to other people, because you don't know what's going on. I mean, maybe they're hesitant to meet. Maybe they have an underlying medical condition that they don't necessarily want to broadcast to everybody. And it's not something you could see, but maybe they have a real private medical condition and they can't be put at risk. So just give people the benefit of the doubt, and that they're not trying to torpedo your program. Oh, this was the faith formation coordinator, and now she doesn't want to have an in-person Bible study. Try to talk it out with her and maybe allay her fears. But, sometimes you have to respect, people where they are, and then just try to build cohesion. Be a peacemaker and a cohesion builder.
Yeah.
Any final thoughts, Elizabeth, before we wrap up on conflict management in times of COVID and non?
COVID and non. I like what you're saying about, a conflict you might have had in your chapel or in your community that didn't get resolved before the pandemic wasn't resolved. It was just tabled. I think so. In the book, on page 117, I gave some ideas for conflict resolution, and the first thing that's there is identify the conflict, what it is and what it isn't. And sometimes if you've had a conflict that in your heart has drawn out for a long time, what it is and what it isn't is a lot more of your feelings and how you've internalized it and how you've ruminated on it versus what the original conflict was. So as you are reopening, if there are things there, I would just really kind of go through almost an examination of conscience to say, okay, what is it that needs to be resolved? What is it that's just me personally feeling, having my feelings hurt or having my ego bruised, versus what is the conflict that has to do with the mission of what we're called to do? How are we affecting the mission? And if we just keep going back to the mission, I think we can help weed out maybe what we might have let ruminate in our hearts or in our minds or in our spirits over the closure. So to go back with just a renewed sense of mission. I'll go back to Easter. What is the renewed sense of mission? And then I think the other thought is, I framed this around Saint Faustina: deeds, prayers, deeds, prayers, and words of mercy. If you have a conflict with someone, what is a deed of mercy that you can do to resolve it? And what is a word of mercy you can do to resolve it? And sometimes your word of mercy is zip, just don't say anything. Just don't say anything. And it can be so hard to do that, but sometimes just not saying anything is better. And prayers of mercy, how do you we have to pray for those people who we feel conflict with, and if you want authority on that, then just go to the Our Father. As we forgive those who trespass against us, we have an obligation to pray. We have an obligation to pray for a resolution of conflict for people we feel in conflict with. So I think those are thoughts, but like above all things, humility. And it can be so hard, and like this was a hard chapter to write because there was some stuff that I really had to consider and forgive in the process of writing it. And it doesn't mean there's resolution to it. It means that, I've forgiven it and moved on. So this was a hard chapter to write, this one. And this was a hard chapter to write.
Hey, George. Well, wow. So, I want to encourage all of our MCCW ladies to join us on Wednesday to discuss this more at length. 7 o'clock Eastern Daylight Time, we'll meet together to discuss this. We want to hear about how you've evaluated your CWOC program, how maybe you've changed because of the coronavirus, how you've adjusted your ministry, or how you're looking forward to doing that in the fall. And we want to hear about conflict and we just want to talk to you more about how you've dealt with it in the past, maybe neatly or not so neatly, and how reconciliation has helped you make a more positive environment at your CWOC. So right now, our study guide for chapters 6 and 7 are up on the website, MCCW. If you go to mccw.org and go over to MCCW News, there's a really cute little green graphic that will take you to the Joyful Momentum Book Club. So you can see all of our things there. You can see our these author chats, the Zoom links for our Q&As on Zoom on Wednesdays, and the study guides. So next week is going to be our last week, by the way. We're going to be talking about passing the baton, mentorship, and accompaniment. I'm really excited about that chapter and the conclusion. So again, on Wednesday, we'll discuss these 2 chapters, and then next week is our last week. So please join us. Please tell your friends and join our MCCW group so you can discuss. Thanks for joining us, Kim and Elizabeth, as always. We really appreciate that. It was cool that Kim came and kind of mixed it up today. Gave us kind of new energy. So thank you very much. Let's see. And